Hello. To celebrate the announcement that John Henry Newman is going to be named a Doctor of the Church this year, I'd like to share with you in this video a recorded lecture from my spring 2025 epistemology class, which featured a close reading of John Henry Newman's Essay in Aid of a Grammar of Assent. This is just me in the classroom in front of a digital board. We are going to be reading in this passage, we're going to be discussing a particular part of chapter 10 of this book. Chapter 10 is the final chapter in the grammar. Its title is Inference and Assent in the Matter of Religion, by which Newman means specifically Christianity. We'll be talking about the beginning of section 2 of chapter 10, section 2 titled Revealed Religion. Among the topics discussed here, we'll talk about Newman's method and how he arrives at truth and conclusions. And we'll talk a little bit about the relation between revealed religion and natural religion, what Newman means by natural religion, which was the subject of the first section of chapter 10, and how revealed religion builds upon and goes beyond it. One thing I do have to apologize for before I show you the recording is my old enemy, the autofocus on the classroom camera. As I pace back and forth across the front of the classroom, it periodically zooms out, gets blurry, and zooms back in, trying to fix on me. I will work on fixing that if I ever record any other classroom lectures of mine, but it is a problem with this one, and I hope you don't find it too distracting. At the very least, I suppose you could just look away and listen to what I have to say. So with that introduction, I hope you find this a rewarding video. Please let me know what you think of it in the comments below. Here's the lecture. All right, if there are no questions, then let's turn on to the section on revealed religions, section 2 of chapter 10 of the Grammar of Assent, and it begins in this edition on page 318. It begins with a 5-page introduction, and then with numbered sections, he's treating a different topic. And as I said before, there's quite a lot interesting to find in what he says here. Note also he's writing at a time in which he could simply include long untranslated Latin footnotes with the expectation that anybody who is curious to chase down his sources would be able to read Latin. I cannot, so I won't try to translate those for you, but certainly gives you an idea of the kind of intellectual environment he was writing in and some of the sources he was engaging with there. So the section begins. In determining as above the main features of natural religion and distinguishing it from the religion of philosophy or civilization, keep in mind that we're dealing with, in the previous section, with what I call primitive religions, religions prior to philosophical reflection, certainly prior to modern sophistication, to define himself against. We'll see him distinguish again here between a certain kind of modern religious sensibility, modern for him meaning middle and second half of the 19th century. I may be accused of having taken a course of my own for which I have not sufficient warrant. Such an accusation does not give me much concern, but he will, the remainder of this paragraph, proceed to justify his project. I may be attacked for, by investigating natural religion, I am not sufficiently justified in doing so. Everyone who thinks on these subjects will take a course of his own, but will also happen to be the course which others take besides himself. The minds of many separately bear them forward in the same direction, and they are permitted by each other. This I consider to be my own case. What is his justification? What's his justification for discussing natural religion in the way that he has? Yeah, guys, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
Oh, no,
Sir.
his experience and then his illness sins.
Okay. Coming up on the next page.
Okay. In both these cases, something very specific and concrete to him, John Henry Newman himself. Some of us may wonder how this is distinct from saying, well, everybody just makes up their own mind according to whatever seems to them to be the right way of doing things. That certainly would be an extreme version of that kind of appeal to private judgment, one's own judgment. But it leaves us sort of at a loose end as to how we actually draw any conclusions at all. Why write a book here except that people who already agree with you will read the book and then agree with you still more? That doesn't seem like that's a properly philosophical or intellectual attitude. What more does he say? If I have misstated or omitted notorious facts in my account of natural religion, if I have contradicted or disregarded anything which he who speaks through my conscience, capitalized he, so speaking of God here. So if I've said anything false about natural religion, about primitive caveman religion, I called it last time, or if I've said anything about the natural religion which rises up naturally through human beings, their natural, what I call natural religious sensibility, if I've said anything that contradicts the dictates of God in rational religion, serious thing for a clergyman, a priest, a bishop, and cardinal, then indeed I have acted unjustifiably and I have something to unsay. Okay, all right, so if I've made an error or if I've contradicted revelation, this is certainly bad for me, and I ought not to have done so. Keep in mind, he's not simply speaking to us here extemporaneously. He's written this book and published it for the reading public. These are his considered thoughts that he's put in this order, expressed in just this way. So we hold him to a higher standard for what he leaves in and what he omits, or what he could have omitted, than we would if I were just, for example, speaking off the cuff. That's what I'll ask you guys. I'm kind of speculating here. I'm saying it as it comes to me, but if I say something theologically wrong, I don't expect that people need to be alarmed, right? There's no 5 alarm letters to the bishop. Immediately, we investigate, we talk about it, we correct the error. Here, but this is the turn in this paragraph. If I have done no more than view the notorious facts of the case in the medium of my primary mental experiences under the aspects that they spontaneously present to me, and with the aid of my best illative sense, so Kaz, the 2 elements you mentioned, right? I've looked at the facts of the case, right, judged them in light of my experience, my illative sense, my inner prudential judgment with respect to acts of knowledge. I only do on one side of the question what those who think differently do on the other. In a sense, this is what we all do. Nobody does otherwise. The person who contradicts me appeals to the facts of the case in light of his own experience and his own inner judgment, his own relative sense, no less than I do. So if I have made a mistake, I'm responsible for the mistake, but I am still justified in speaking as I have spoken, because how else could I have spoken? The correction will have to come in light of one of these things, either correcting my illative sense or expanding my experiences. As they start from one set of first principles, I start with another. So there is something here which we can judge. We can judge, is he speaking consistently with his own principles? Is he following out his declared starting points and assumptions correctly? And that might be a matter of logical consistency. What I can't do is start with one set of principles and then arrive at a conclusion that is contrary to them. I wouldn't expect any more of you if you're a socialist. I would expect you to reason from your first principles to the conclusions and details of your socialist system. Right? It is we see here the appearance of something that we'll appeal to frequently throughout this section, which is the role that these first principles and assumptions play in what follows. So starting as I've started, I have ended as I must have ended. I gave notice just now that I should offer my own witness in the matter in question, though of course it would not be worth my offering unless what I felt myself agreed with what is felt by hundreds of thousands besides me, as I'm sure it does. Whatever would be the measure, more or less, of their explicit recognition of it. So this is, in a sense, always going to be my story. I'll tell you how things appear to me. And maybe an echo here of Socrates. Socrates will say, from time to time, and certainly in the final speech of the Phaedo, the death scene, he concludes his discourse of the soul by saying, whether these things are the way, in fact, it is with the soul and immortality, is for the gods to say. But this is certainly how they appear to me, giving us the idea that this is my best considered judgment of the facts of the case from what's available to me right now. I won't dogmatically assert a kind of metaphysical, undeniable truth to these things. Yes, sir.
This is just kind of really, again, really interesting going along with the Nietzsche claims that all philosophy is
Autobiographical, right?
Yeah,
Newman
just takes that and owns it. You know?
He's not hiding from it, certainly. And the fact that he's certainly not trying to mimic Nietzsche. He's writing this, I think, before Nietzsche publishes much of anything.
Yeah.
In his own name and in German, a language I don't think that Newman reads. Not certain of that. It feels like it's part of the spirit of the age. This is the second half of the 19th century. I've already mentioned we've gone through the French Revolution, the utter annihilation of the old order, conquest of Napoleon, the overturning of the political order in most of the countries of Europe, the attempts at reform of monarchies around Europe, the failure of the revolution of 1848, and the rise of a more radical political sensibility, more revolutionary ideas. Newman is part of this whole thing. England seems somewhat insulated from this. There is not necessarily the same kind of turmoil in England, but it does seem like the kind of the intellectual moment. This is where people are going now. It's sort of where Newman goes, and like as you said, you indicate, he leans into it. He's not shy about it. But on the other hand, I'm doing no less than what everybody does. And if I were unique in this, if I were the only person, I was sort of, John Henry Newman, the stylite, off by himself, and nobody agreed with me, my words would not be that interesting. But I'm saying something that is agreed with by hundreds of thousands of other people, more than that, almost certainly, in drawing the conclusions I draw, and therefore, we might say it's worth attention for that ground, on those grounds alone. Is it reasonable, etc. So his justification here, this appeal to the illative sense being, he thinks, inescapable, and therefore neither more nor less than what any of his critics is doing in criticizing him. The following paragraph, it's thus speaking of natural religion as in one sense a matter of private judgment, and that with a view of proceeding from it to the proof of Christianity, that may seem to be give up the intention of demonstrating either. So here's this idea that, how did I do that? Sorry. Judgments about natural religion are going to be private and individual. They depend upon personal experience and each person's individual illative sense. Private judgment should be kind of an alarm word, indicating perhaps the Protestant orientation towards a certain kind of Protestant orientation towards religious truth. I would expect, though I don't know for certain, I'd expect to see appeals to private judgment in Christianity condemned by Catholic apologists and defenders of Newman's day. It'd be interesting to see if that's some sort of common thing. But in general, can you guys backing up on this? If I say, using your private judgment about affairs of theology seems hazardous at best for a Catholic. So if it looks like I've appealed to private judgment in natural religion, it's a bit different because we judge that just by reason and our knowledge of history and human psychology. Okay, we don't have to appeal to divine veracity for conclusions about natural religion. And if I'm then trying to try to, on the basis of this groundwork in natural religion, in the religious sensibility of the caveman, so to speak loosely, and then I want to prove on that basis that Christianity should be true, I might seem to have given up the intention of demonstrating either. Of course, how do I demonstrate, how do I get you to share my private judgment? And even if you share my private judgment, it's just the two of us. How on earth do we get to the idea of the real, we might say, common or objective truth of the Christian religion from there? And it looks like you're not going to be proving anything. You're simply going to be talking perhaps to people who agree with you or people who share your judgments. Next sentence, a bit of a surprise for me. Certainly I do. Not that I deny that such demonstration is possible. I could be proving anything and demonstrating anything in the way that you expect. Truth certainly as such rests upon grounds intrinsically and objectively and abstractly demonstrative. But it does not follow from this that the arguments producible in its favor are unanswerable and irresistible. Okay, something important has happened here. The reason I'm slowing down through this paragraph is because I think we can get something out of a careful reading of these sentences. What does he say? Bottom of page 318. Truth certainly as such rests upon grounds intrinsically, objectively, and abstractly demonstrative. Truth rests upon these grounds. It looks like it is. I don't know that I don't think I've changed this meaning too much. Truth by its very nature is demonstrable, right? Rests upon grounds that are capable of demonstration and proof. It does not follow from this that the arguments producible in its favor, in favor of truth, are unanswerable and irresistible. Meaning what? It's the distinction between the truth, which is itself of a certain character, objectively and abstractly demonstrable, but whatever arguments we can come up with in its favor, keep in mind the arguments are going to be real concrete human creations. Those are not necessarily compelling. It doesn't follow from the fact that it can be demonstrated that we are capable of, with our arguments, producing irresistible, unanswerable arguments for it. Meaning they still might be answerable and resistible. The arguments that we are able to give. Continuing, if I may, page 319. These latter epithets are relative. They bear upon matters of facts. Arguments in themselves ought to do what perhaps in a particular case they cannot do. The fact of revelation is itself demonstrably true, but is there not, therefore, irresistibly? Else, therefore, how comes it to be resisted? Pause and just for a moment. These latter epithets, unanswerable and irresistible, I might say, for whom? Okay, I'm working in the concrete here. Now I am a speaker. I'm addressing you as my listener, giving you an argument. Okay? Is my argument unanswerable and irresistible? Well, it doesn't follow from the very nature of what I'm trying to prove, even its provability, that my argument for it, or any argument I could give for it, would necessarily be such as to be irresistibly compelling in a rational sense to any audience or to each specific audience that I offer it to. And I'm going beyond just observing here, I think, that people differ in their ability to be persuaded. So Dominic here is very perceptive. We'll get it right away, where Kaz here is kind of stubborn and distractible. Will take a while to sort of get around to seeing the obvious blinding truth, which was immediately apparent to somebody with some greater intellectual power at his disposal. It's not just that. That might be it. But it seems that, to me, that what he's saying is we're entering into the human realm and the realm of arguments. We can't appeal to the abstract qualities, objective qualities of the truth and expect them to be reflected in these arguments made of clay, these human institutions made of, I'll say, clay. It simply doesn't follow that they necessarily are resistible. The first thing to keep in mind is that since we're working in the concrete, it's not an argument which is addressed to whoever happens along. It's an argument addressed by me to you. Okay, so it takes part in each of our finite and imperfect character. I need to be a good judge of your character, a good sort of observer of your intellectual abilities, your state of character, your mood, to know what kind of things you are ready to hear, what kind of things you can profitably hear and incorporate into your way of knowing. I'm familiar with your ability of sense in the specific area in which I'm trying to persuade you, in order to persuade you well. I think that to be part of what he's saying here is that we fall into this kind of a problem of Cartesian abstraction that I go on about over and over again this semester. If we suppose that because the truth has this quality, our arguments are capable of mimicking it successfully. Arguments in themselves ought to do what perhaps in the particular case they cannot do. And it should be possible theoretically, given that it's a demonstrable truth, to create an argument that demonstrates it effectively for everyone. I say that's Descartes' ambition with respect to all of his arguments, all of his conclusions. But in fact, in the particular case, they cannot. Revelation is demonstrably true, but it's not irresistibly true because people resist it. Again, that appeal to facts. Not everybody is persuaded of the truths that we argue for. That by itself tells us that we've not gotten to the irresistible argument. Yes.
How does this address certain people who might be engaging in this argument? For instance, like if a child came into this classroom and was listening to this, the child would not understand anything that we're talking about.
Right.
So how does this, I'm trying to figure out a way to word it, but like how does this address those kinds of like the different types of people who might be engaging in these arguments or might be hearing this and then not understanding?
Well, I think part of this is the difference between the abstract and the concrete. And for Newman, the concrete relation here, I said, me persuading you, not the argument as the sort of abstraction or any argument that however abstract you want to make it, whatever level of generality. So if I'm speaking to children, I modulate my premises and my appeal to children. I expect about as much as it's reasonable to expect children to be able to get out of it. If there's a prodigy among them, I'm impressed. I can dial it up a little bit, but I speak in a different mode.
Right.
So it's part of it, it seems to me, is respecting the concrete, the priority of the concrete needs of the situation, right? Of the facts of the case. That seems to me to be right. Now, I do want to have a sort of general theory of argument. I want to have a sort of abstract grasp of things, but it seems to be saying that's going to be far less important, certainly at the beginning stage, and towards actually accomplishing things. Your overall theory is less important than the actual matching of what's going on to the lay of the land.
So it's like your argument shouldn't have to change because of the audience.
To suppose that the argument shouldn't have to change because of the audience would be a mistake, I didn't say. They always have to vary according to the audience. So the warning here is against abstracting in the wrong place and to the wrong degree. So I'm trying to abstract my arguments and present an argument which can persuade everybody. He's going to appeal to Paley's watchmaker argument here, which is sort of part of his era. It's going to indicate why he thinks that it's inferior as an argument, not necessarily because it can't persuade, because it tries to persuade in the wrong way. It's too abstract. We'll go through that in a moment. Other questions or comments? Thank you. Yes, Matthew.
On that last sentence, the fact of revelation is in itself demonstrably true. What is he referring to exactly with the revelation?
That is a good question.
Is it like capital R or just
The fact of revelation? It could be the fact that there is revelation, right? The fact that revelation has happened without specifying its content. My assumption reading it is that he means the actuality of the events that are given to us and described by revelation. Christ rose from the dead, right? The body that was dead, then afterwards was alive. This actually happened. It's not a metaphor. It's not a sort of spiritual reality hidden behind some sort of obscurity of memory or the body, right? He wasn't in a coma for 3 days and then reawakened. That's what I'm inclined to think he means. but it could mean, there might be one or two other meanings available there, but revelation, it is going to say, look, it is a fact. It's true. It's even demonstrably true. It is by its very truth, because it's true by its very nature. It should be possible to prove it. And yet, maybe sort of taking the clue from the story of doubting Thomas, right? The proving of it is maybe not the most important thing about it, the finding the proof for it. So part of the warning here is against, here's another 19th century trend, one here that I think he's resisting, against trying to make everything scientific in the realm of knowledge and of argument. This is the sort of era of reaction against the kind of over-scientizing of human knowledge. We have people pursuing the scientific study of history, the scientific study of religion, the scientific study of ancient languages, of texts. And I was just reading about this yesterday. It's around this time period in the 19th century that scholars have become aware that the author cited, of course, through all medieval period as Dionysius the Areopagite was in fact pseudo-Dionysius, as we call it now. Dionysius was a first century figure described in scripture, spoke to the Apostle Paul, I think. The character writing as Dionysius is 4th or 5th century Neoplatonist. The way we know this is he actually quotes Proclus, who died in 485, in his texts, 385. If you're quoting somebody from the 300s, you certainly are not writing in the 100s. So now he's pseudonym. He adopted Dionysius as a pseudonym. But that's what you discover only by a certain kind of inquiry into and sort of skepticism with respect to the sources of biblical texts. That's when those kind of discoveries are being made by scholars across the board. So, here's a place where Newman's pushing against the over reliance upon the physical scientific model of knowing and of knowledge. Yes, Sabrina?
I was going to say, is there ever a case where like truth is like demonstrative? Like for example, like, objective truth is subjective truth, right? Like,
Yeah.
For example, because you also believe some things to be true that's not really universal.
Right.
And in that case, like that can't really be demonstrated by everyone.
Right. Well, I think Newman's staying away from the words objective and subjective, but maybe we'll look for them in here and what's coming. He prefers abstract and concrete, and I can say sort of truths that are known to me, right? Truths about me and my relative sense. I can only judge with my relative sense and you with yours. So there's an important kind of subjective separation between us. And yet we can speak and our words bear the same meaning or very similar meanings. So when you and I look at something, we can form judgments about it and we're talking about the same thing. So he does think that we share a world in common. There's not any sort of deep question about the reality of the world that we share. This part of this is his empirical focus and his appeal to just common sense, not entertaining Cartesian doubts that your subjective truth is radically different from my subjective truth. I think he does want to say that truth by its very nature should be capable of demonstration, but it may be that, look, I can't look inside of your mind to see your experiences in a relative sense that would inform your judgment. So I can't have the experiences that would be necessary for me to have the justification for what you believe. This is tricky, though. We're kind of walking this line between the objective and the subjective. And I'd like to try to resolve this before we conclude the course, because there's something there that we can speak to decisively. The more he leans into this subjective element of it, the more we worry that are we ever going to get back to the place where we are all talking about the same truth instead of just about mine and yours and his and hers. Newman obviously thinks so. He wouldn't be who he was. He wouldn't speak the way he spoke if he thought we were locked up inside of a sort of Nietzschean perspectivalism. But we need to see how he gets back out. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Aristotle's distinction between episteme and nous, as truth reached through like that kind of conditional inference episteme, or then nous is in just this all at once direct experience of truth, right? And that's how you know certain first principles,
Right.
like non-contradiction. And at first I was kind of wondering, was Newman kind of maybe trying to do a similar thing here, but then the problem is that we kind of be at odds with this truth is by its nature demonstrable, because wouldn't Aristotle actually himself disagree with that? Like not all truth is necessarily demonstrable. In fact, it can't be, otherwise arguments run on forever, right?
Right.
But
He does appeal to first principles here. Maybe I'm the one who's put in the all in front of the all, truth. I said truth by its nature is demonstrable. What he said here, just quote him, truth certainly as such rests upon grounds intrinsically and objectively and abstractly demonstrative. I take your point about nous, and I think about judgment of first principles. He's going to speak here about differences in first principles and how they might be a bit about what difference they put between us. It may be this thing like this appeal to nous. He, of course, quotes Aristotle at length later in this section. Let's keep that alive and carry it forward next bits. I won't read the whole chapter out loud, although sometimes I'm tempted. So I got onto page 319, it's the second page of the chapter. There is a vast distance between what truth is in and of itself and what it is to us. There's the distinction we've been talking about, I think. Light is a quality of matter, as truth is in Christianity, but light is not recognized by the blind, and there are those who do not recognize truth, from the fault not of truth, but of themselves. I cannot convert men when I ask for assumptions which they refuse to grant me, and without assumptions, no one can prove anything about anything. And here's this appeal to first principles. Right? There are assumptions that I'm making that are necessary conditions for the proofs that I'm presenting to get off the ground. Well, if you won't give them to me, then it's futile for me to speak to you with my argument. The point here is the argument is going to depend upon some kind of shared set of first principles or beliefs prior to the argument. Maybe this is the place where the appeal to nous would be. What I do know is that if your first principles are radically different from mine, then my arguments will be of only maybe kind of an academic interest to you. They certainly won't persuade you. We're already coming across something that we associate maybe a bit more with the postmodern age, which is radical conflict of first principles. You think differently from the way I think, and in a way that is beyond the reach of argument. So what's the point here of arguing? Why not retreat into subjective truth? Just to get a bit more of this, I do want to get out of this first section into the section number 1 in a moment. Next paragraph, I am suspicious of scientific demonstrations and the question of concrete facts in a discussion between fallible men, like I said just a moment ago. Right? The concrete argument between you and me, or my attempt to persuade you, is words between a fallible being and a fallible being. There are problems here that should hold us back from adopting scientific demonstration, sort of absolute demonstrative certainty. Think of Descartes and his expectations of the kind of proofs that he's trying to do. It should hold us back from attempting those sorts of proofs or adopting that sort of a model. For me, it is more congenial to my own judgment to attempt to prove Christianity in the same informal way in which I can prove it for certain that I have been born into this world and that I shall die out of it. That's a nice turn of phrase. I shall attempt to prove Christianity how? Not by demonstration, right? He says, I seem to have given up on demonstrating Christianity. He says, yes, absolutely, I have. Not going to give a Cartesian or a scientific proof of Christianity. What will I give you instead? I will give you an informal proof. The same informal proof leads me to be certain that I was born in this world. Think about that in a Cartesian way. I say, what convinces you that you were born on the day you were born, or that you were born at all? Well, your memory. But memory is fallible. Right? If I treat it as a fallible messenger, the way Descartes treats his senses in Meditation 1, I would treat it with a certain kind of arm's length distance. Well, what other evidence do I have besides that? You guys recall that for Descartes, it's not until I prove that God is all-powerful, God loves me, and God is not a deceiver, that I actually can trust things like my memory and my senses and whatever else it is I'm appealing to give me the basic facts of my life and of my existence. For Newman, well, this was something that I arrived at certainty about earlier in the book. And then he quotes this theological writer Amort, whom he includes these long Latin footnotes for. I'll note here, top of page 20, bottom of 319 before it. In this work, he adopts the argument merely of greater probability. I prefer to rely on that, the method of an accumulation of various probabilities. It's a good turn of phrase. We think back to the earlier argument that Great Britain is an island. How do I know? Well, all the maps say so. Nobody's ever testified that they've found a land bridge. People tell me that they've circumnavigated the island. I've not done so myself. In order for it to be false, everybody would have to be wrong or lying, which would involve a vast conspiracy that's never broken ever since I was a child. My parents would have to be either mistaken or deceiving me, et cetera, et cetera. I put all those things together. No single one of them proves in a kind of logically demonstrative way that Great Britain must be an island, but the weight of all of them is overwhelming, so much so that I'm absolutely certain about it. And I would, that expression maybe that applies to me more than to the younger generations, I would bet the mortgage money on it, right? Money that I absolutely have to have. So there's this thing called a mortgage. I apologize. That's not kind. The difficult times we live in. We'll all of us in this together. I would wager any amount of money on Great Britain's being an island. Okay, for a stable and non-tricky definition of island. Obviously, I was going to say obviously, the evidence is overwhelming, and it gives me certainty. So what is that? That is not a knockdown, drag out. Sorry, here's the three premises which prove undeniably that it is. It's the weight of all of the evidence and the absence of any contrary evidence. This case is maybe not quite so strong for William Shakespeare's authorship of the plays that bear his name. I think it's very strong, but there is a sort of devoted group of Oxfordians who argue that somebody else wrote those plays and put William of Stratford's name on them. So I still think, to my mind, the probabilities are overwhelming. So what happens here? We have the accumulation of probabilities, no one of which is decisive, but all of which together, in the absence of contrary evidence of a sufficient character, is enough to give us certainty. Could we be wrong? I suppose in some kind of abstract theoretical sense, the universe wouldn't be irrational or broken if I were wrong about that. I can imagine a universe where Great Britain is not an island, and to that extent it's imaginable, it's conceivable by the mind that it should be so. But in the world that I know, all the evidence, the weight of the evidence, the preponderance, the accumulation of probabilities points absolutely in the opposite direction. So can this be done then with respect to revealed religion? I was thinking of an example of this, just came to me. You guys have seen, those of you who know classic movies have seen the end of the Maltese Falcon. There's a bit where, and not to spoil the movie because it is a good movie to see, it's about 1940, 44 maybe. Sam is talking to Bridget at the end. He's talking about things. There's a number of factors that influence his crucial decision at the end of the movie. He says, no one of them is really decisive, but look at the number of them and look at the magnitude of the weight of them. Jack, you know what I'm talking about. If you know the scene I'm talking about, I'm trying not to spoil it to people. But he has that same sort of appeal, right? There's no one thing that makes me come to this conclusion, but there's a whole bunch of little things that are all sort of gathered up and they're all pointing in the same direction. And that's the conclusion that I have to draw. So that's a famous movie, The Maltese Falcon. Worth watching if you like classic films and murder mysteries or mysteries. From the probabilities we may construct a legitimate proof sufficient for certitude. I follow him in holding that since good providence watches over us, he blesses us with such means of arguments as it has pleased him, God, to give us in the nature of man and of the world. And if we use these means, means of logical argument, duly for the ends for which God has given them, and that, as in mathematics, we are justified in using the dictate of nature in withholding our assent from a conclusion, of which we have not yet a strict logical demonstration, so by a like dictate, we are not justified in the case of concrete reasoning, and especially religious inquiry, in waiting until such logical demonstration is ours. But on the contrary, we are bound in conscience to seek truth and look for certainty by modes of proof which, when reduced to the shape of formal propositions, fail to satisfy the severe requisitions of science. I think he's giving us here his judgment. I apologize for the very long paragraph, although I think if you can follow the flow of his writing, it's rather clear. We should prove things. God has given us different ways of using our judgment and our reasoning, of arguing, and each one of them is appropriate to a particular area of argument. Essentially, each area of argument has its appropriate mode of reasoning, and so it's right for us to take the gauge of how we are made and of how our minds work and how our reason works, and to use our reason in an appropriate way with respect to each topic before us. So we would prove each thing by its appropriate mode of reasoning, its appropriate mode of argumentation. So mathematical truths, we seek demonstration. If I lack a demonstration, I don't believe the conclusion until I have a demonstration. I'm trying to think of a mathematical principle that's been recently proven. Was it Andrew Wiley proved Fermat's last theorem? That's maybe 15 or 20 years ago now, so before your guys' time. You guys familiar with Fermat's last theorem? Okay. Just to mention this, you can look it up if you wish. I don't know why I remember the name of the mathematician, but Andrew Wiley. It was a kind of a big sensation maybe back in the 90s or the aughts, that a mathematical problem that had been sort of an unproven formula, not proven to definitely be true or false, was finally solved by a contemporary mathematician using computer models that go vastly beyond what the men who first sort of posed the theorem, Fermat, back in what, the 18th century, or whenever it was. But he finally proved it. It's proved definitively that, I don't remember what it was. I remember what it was. Don't ask me how I know these things, but it's things stick in my mind. I forget ordinary and important things, but I remember this. Fermat's last theorem was that the general form of the Pythagorean theorem, okay, 3 integers each raised to a power, two of which sum to the third, works for n equals 1 and n equals 0 trivially, but and for n equals 2, it's the Pythagorean theorem, but there are no integer solutions a, b, and c for the case of n greater than 2. So if you're cubing, there's no 2 cubes that add up to a third cube. There's no 2 fourth powers that add up to a fourth power. I believe. I don't know if I'm wasting your time on this, but yeah. The question is, we can see that this is false. We can plug in all the numbers and find out it doesn't work for any numbers that we try. Can we prove that absolutely no matter how high a, b, and c go, there cannot possibly be any? And that's what Andrew Wiley proved, that in fact this is true. There are no integer solutions for values of n greater than 2 in this problem. Simple to state, then even to understand, turns out to be very difficult to prove. So for all that time, this theorem is held to be unsolved. We don't know whether it's true. We suspect it's probably true. Nobody's yet found a solution that makes it true. But if somebody does, right, the simple way to disprove an E statement, a universal negative, is to produce a single example of A, B, and C and N that do satisfy this case. So I've withheld my judgment about the truth of this until I get the demonstrative proof. Much later, centuries later, we hold it open. But that's not the case in religion, especially in concrete cases in general. There we use, I take it he's saying, the accumulation of probabilities. We look at, same way we look at Great Britain being an island, at my birthday being the date that I've been told. I say, well, there's no absolute refutation of all possible objections, but all the evidence points in one direction, no evidence points in a different direction. I think I said with respect to the birthday question, if I learned that I narrowly missed out on inheriting millions of dollars because my birthday was one day later than it was, I might investigate much more closely the possibility that there was some sort of conspiracy. Now it seems to me reasonable that maybe some people would have a financial interest in making me believe I was born on the 24th when I was born on the 25th, in fact. But absent that, something to go on, I don't investigate things in that way. I don't withhold my assent from these truths the way I do in mathematics. Notice here, explicit rejection of the Cartesian, understanding that we should always be able to withhold our assent from what is not decisively and demonstrably proven. And Descartes, in a sense, wants to export this mathematical method to every act of judgment in every frame of science, in every area of knowledge. Where am I on time? I have 20 minutes left. I'm on page 3. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was curious, like, what is saying that's so distinct here in the sense, like, for example,
Yeah.
that example you just gave, I mean, even before this mathematical proof that came out more recently, I think somebody could say, you know, well, every answer I've attempted on this hasn't worked, and so I've accumulated probabilities to think it's true.
Right. And that's good enough for saying that we can treat it as though it's true. Although there are some hazards. Occasionally there's one of these open conjectures that is proved the opposite way. Right? We suspect that tiling patterns tend to be like this. Somebody discovers a new way of orienting, the molecules in a carbon atom. There's actually 3. There's not just 2, like they thought. Or there's some other some solution that's not been anticipated before. So I would say the chief thing here, and the thing that I think gets Descartes, is that you can demand demonstrations about abstractions. But Newman has begun by saying, where we abstract and we have concrete realities, I have this empirical focus that prefers and privileges the concrete realities. It's the person, it's what we call the pious grandma solution. It's the pious grandma who is more deeply connected with the realities of conscience, of religion, of God, and the like. I would hope, therefore, that a person who was a very good abstract theologian would also be, kind of a pious grandma inside, would be deeply connected to the realities of things. But it is possible, sort of what I'll call the Cartesian error, is to over-prefer and privilege the abstractions to the detriment to the ignorance of the concrete, the conclusions about the concrete, and the right method for drawing conclusions about the concrete, which takes us to the illative sense, not to the rational deduction of conclusions from premises using logical rules. That makes sense.
Yeah.
This distinction is not new in Newman. I noted here in the margins of page 3 to 20 is exactly the same distinction that Pascal makes when he separates religion from Cartesian demonstration. Let me go quickly through the remaining pages of this first section. I'm sorry to have spent quite so much time on it. At the top of page 321, in the paragraph that begins here, then at once, he writes, "It is not wonderful," by which I mean he thinks unbelievable, "then that while I can prove Christianity divine to my own satisfaction, I shall not be able to force it upon anyone else." And here we're back to this sort of subjective-objective question that's raised. I can prove it, and I can prove it with certainty sufficient to satisfy myself and my illative sense, but I don't have those rational tools of mathematics to force you on pain of irrationality to admit the truth that I see. Doesn't mean that my admission of this truth or your refusal to admit it is arbitrary or willful or based upon something irrational or I want to say particular, spiteful. Right? It's that if I'm going to prove Christianity true or divine to you, I'm going to have to take account of your illative sense, your ability to judge based upon the evidence that's presented. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to present falsehoods to you. I'm not going to misrepresent the real, but I need to present the real to you in a way that you get it. Right? This is not so much about proving it as about you getting it. Does that make sense? Sort of that insight, that the place where the inner judgment says yes. So if you ask me for a proof of God, and you don't specify who I'm persuading, it's not me and you, but I'm writing a book, well, I have to give you the proof that satisfies me, and the proof that I think might satisfy you if your experience, if your inner judgment are tuned about the way that mine is. Perhaps not, in which case perhaps I need to try to draw you closer to a new and different set of experiences. So there's a type of preparation that seems to be necessary for this kind of argument and arguing. Later in that same paragraph, actually, let me just continue. I think he's in good form here. Multitudes indeed I ought to succeed in persuading this truth without any force at all, because they and I start from the same principles. Here's the problem. I said before that maybe the book's just written for people who already agree with him. Well, let me say this. If you start from the same principles I start with, you will follow my reasoning very closely, and it will be very clear to you. And what is a proof for me is a proof for them. But if anyone starts from other principles but ours, I have not the power to change his principles or the conclusion which he draws from them, any more than I can make a crooked man straight. Yeah, I can't reach into your mind and change your principles, and I can't present you with an argument that changes your principles because the arguments stand upon the principles. What I can do is observe the difference in our principles. What can I do? I can't argue for the superiority of my principles. I can say, look at what beautiful conclusions come from my first principles, and look at what conclusions, about that are perhaps not preferable in some aesthetic or practical sense, come from your first principles. Right? I might appeal to experience. I might appeal to conscience, this thing he thinks is inside each person, but I can't appeal to my conscience. I have to appeal to yours. I have to get you to examine yours, see what you see there. And it really is giving the priority to the subject. But you have to get it. You have to feel it. You have to see it inside. Whether his mind will ever grow straight, whether I can do anything towards its becoming straight, whether he is not responsible to his maker for being mentally crooked is another matter. It's totally independent of whether I can actually speak to him argumentatively, given his principles. Still, the fact remains that in any inquiry about things in the concrete, it's the important point, it's the important judgment. Men differ from each other not so much in the soundness of their reasoning as in the principles which govern its exercise, that those principles are of a personal character, that there is where there is no common measure of minds, there is no common measure of arguments, and that the validity of proof is determined not by any scientific test, but by the illative sense. That's where we find the truth in judgments about concrete matters, which he says are going to be religious matters, especially. I'm not going to prove a theory of Christianity, I'm going to prove the actual truth of Christianity. To do that, I'm going to have to treat it as a concrete object, a concrete doctrine, teaching, etc. Accordingly, saying that the truths of revelation depend upon those of natural religion is more pertinent. It is more pertinent to say belief in revealed truths depends on belief in natural. It's one of the last things I want to make sure we get to today. There's my pen. I can believe in revealed religion on the strength of my belief in natural religion. I'm drawing upon it. Not that the truths depend upon the truths, not that God had to make human beings in such a way before he could make Jesus rise from the dead. The truths of the one don't depend upon the truths of the other, but in the inner psychology of the human race, collectively and individually, belief in revealed religion depends upon and draws upon belief in natural religion, the beliefs that are characteristic of this natural religiosity. This seems to me a very Catholic attitude, grace building upon nature, what is revealed building upon what is held rationally. He seems to have in mind a kind of adversary, the person suggesting that God might short circuit the natural and leap directly to the revealed. He might tell you the truth about himself in a way that doesn't require you to take account of your inheritance as a natural being. Newman, I think, disagreeing with that type of view. The final paragraph final two paragraphs of this section. That a special preparation of mind is required for each separate department of inquiry and discussion, accepting abstract science, is strongly insisted upon by well-known passages in the Nicomachean Ethics. And here he quotes two long passages from the beginning of the Ethics. I'm sure we quoted it before when we talked about the Aristotelianism of Newman's thought, specifically that every science depends upon a method, and the method depends upon the matter of the science. So one should not expect the same types of proof and the same level of certainty in history that one achieves in mathematics or geometry, still less in psychology and conclusions about the soul, about metaphysics, about politics. And in the realm of ethics, you guys have all read the Nicomachean Ethics. The conclusions about ethics will be general and expressed in outline. Why? Not because there isn't a good, but because the good is diverse and human excellence is noble, and in the realm of what is noble and what is just, there's a great variety, or as I like to put it, there's a lot of variables that have to be taken into account. The variables for me are not going to be the same as the variables for you, so I can't use my method of living a good life to give you precise instructions on how to live your life well. Man's the relationships, the sort of inner psychology of you, and much less of the circumstances you'll face in the future, are going to be different enough for me that the best I can do is to give you a virtuous character to help you train yourself in habits of virtue, of thinking and feeling and acting that will allow you to meet the circumstances of your life, which are unpredictable and not systematizable, will allow you to meet those circumstances with a maximum chance of making the right choice, of making the right judgment. In other words, I build up in you virtues connected with the faculty of prudence and practical wisdom. Newman, we've already said at length, doing the same thing here with respect to the life of knowledge. Conclusion of this opening section. These words of a heathen philosopher laid down broad principles about knowledge, express a general rule which in scripture is applied authoritatively to the case of revealed knowledge. He quotes here several times from the Bible, from the Gospels, and from the Old Testament, places where we are told specifically about the way in which this knowledge of God goes beyond that was there. I have taken us up to 12:07, 8 minutes left. Question about pacing. I realize what we got to and did not get to. Was this too slow? Could I have sped this up and got through more section 1 and 2? Matt?
That's great.
Satisfactory? Okay. The class will last for another 2 years at rate pace. So I will make some decisions about just what to cover. I would like to try to get through much more of this section next time, perhaps not by reading directly, but I do think there's a lot in here as far as the principles go, the relation of natural to revealed religion. It's a specific method of accumulation probability that is specific to, that is appropriate to the concrete facts of revealed religion. In other words, I'm going to try to prove the resurrection. I'm going to get you to believe in it with certainty. What I'm going to do, I'm not going to look for an argument like William Paley's that would convince anybody in a scientific way. I'm going to look for something like an accumulation of probabilities. And what would make me think that it is likely that it happened. And where is the evidence? What direction is the evidence point? Including the testimony and teaching of the church. There is, I didn't get to it, but 323 at the very beginning of the section numbered 1, there is this lengthy description of an attack upon what I think of as being of 19th century modernism in Christianity. People with whom he says, I won't argue. Why? Not because I despise them, not because they have different conclusions from mine, but because their first principles are different from mine and they would not understand, except in a very academic, non-persuasive way, the kinds of arguments I'm trying to make. So what I want to look at next time, especially in section 1, is this idea that there are certain important presuppositions for argument hearing and participating in arguments about revealed religion, the life of faith. We'll take a look at morality and in sections 2 and 3 next time as well. Anticipations against the kind of legalistic arguments of Paley next time. So look for communication from me on Canvas about what to do to prepare for Thursday's class. And if you're not sure that we do today, please make sure you get it in today. Thank you so much, guys. Have a good day, and I'll see you on Thursday. Bye.